Hello, welcome to step 2 of part 3 in a 3-part tutorial series on how to write a philosophy essay. Part 3 as a whole is dedicated to a detailed step-by-step guide to writing a philosophy essay and is more technical than parts 1 and 2. And within part 3, the step we are in now, step 2, is the most technical step. It is therefore the most technical step of the entire series of 9 videos if you're trying to gauge the difficulty level of the rest of the videos. Each video in part 3 covers one of its 6 steps. And while you can skip a step, watch the lessons independently from one another or in any order you wish to watch them, each except the last one assume that you have either watched the previous ones or have sufficient knowledge of the area they cover. However, since this lesson is the most technical lesson of this tutorial series, if you wish, you can jump ahead to lesson 3. And then watch this lesson when you feel more energetic. You should be able to mostly follow step 3 without watching step 2. Also, if the topic of this lesson, evaluating arguments, has been covered in one of your classes to your satisfaction, that is another reason to safely skip this lesson. If not, stay with me and let's go. It might help to have a virtual or electronic notebook handy. In the previous lesson, we were interested in how to read a philosophy text. I explained that what we're looking for when we read a philosophy text is an argument or arguments. We focused on finding arguments in an assigned text. We saw the importance of paraphrasing for separating arguments from the rest of the text. I showed you how an argument can be broken into its premises and a conclusion, or thesis, and what the difference between a deductive and inductive argument is. Let me remind you that we haven't yet started to write the actual essay. Preparation is the key here. In this lesson, I will show you a way of evaluating those arguments you've identified by reading your assigned text or texts. The key concepts in this video are soundness of an argument, validity, and truth. Now, your assignment sheet might not exactly say, evaluate for validity and truth. A simple question such as, do you agree with the author? Or, what do you think of the author's argument? Essentially means the same thing. If your evaluation shows that either some premises are false or the structure of the argument is invalid, you will be disagreeing or partially disagreeing with the argument. If it is the case that both the argument is invalid and a premise or more is false, you will be fully disagreeing with the argument. Otherwise, you're likely to agree with the argument. Now, don't let the name of this step, evaluating arguments, and words like soundness, validity, put you into a panic mode. Often some of this evaluation will have been done for you already. Perhaps by your instructor, or perhaps in a second article provided to you by your essay assignment. But you know what? You can do it all by yourself with some practice. Let's begin by asking what it means to evaluate an argument. To evaluate an argument is to assess whether the argument is sound or not. A philosophical argument, as we said in lesson 1 of part 3, is a series of statements, one of which is the conclusion and the others are the premises of the arguments. Premises are sometimes referred to as assumptions. The important thing to remember is that premises are reasons in support of the conclusion that logically follows from those reasons. The conclusion may also be called a proposition, a claim, a hypothesis, among many other names. In your daily life, and by that I mean at home, at work, among your friends, at school, when traveling, and so on, you regularly evaluate the soundness of assumptions and arguments you're faced with. You do it automatically, but you may not be able to describe how you do it. What you see here is a formal description of what you already know. Explaining how it works is similar to explaining grammar to someone who speaks and writes in a grammatically correct way, most of the time, without quite knowing how. The explanation, therefore, will include some definitions and principles. So to repeat, to evaluate an argument is to discover whether the argument is sound or not. That is the proper terminology for deductive arguments. For inductive arguments, we ask whether the argument is cogent or not. I shall soon talk about that distinction, but let's discuss the commonalities first. Soundness has two components. In ordinary terms, to find out whether an argument is sound or cogent, we have to evaluate it for truth and for logic. Logic's not mysterious. It is about whether the premises and conclusion connect. It is about whether the conclusion follows from what has been already said. You know from your daily life how often you say to another person, "But that does not follow from what you just said." It's the same. There, you just made a logical point. In arguments, truth and logic are different matters. They are independent, but they do have a relationship. In order to understand that relationship, we must start using the technical terms for assessing truth and logic. You have to get used to asking these two most common questions in philosophy, whether you're writing an essay or preparing for an exam. When your professor or TA asks whether the argument is valid, they mean to ask whether the structure or form of the argument is valid. I will use the terms structure or form to help you become used to the distinction between validity and truth. You may wonder why we ask only whether the premises are true. And let me say before I continue that by premise, I mean both clearly stated premises and implied or hidden premises and assumptions. Isn't the main objective to find out whether the conclusion is true? In other words, whether the thesis is true? Why are we focusing on the truth of the premises? Good question. Well, it just happens to be a fact that if an argument is valid and its premises are true, then its conclusion is automatically true. And that is what we mean by a sound argument. A sound argument must have both true premises and a valid structure. You understand truth. You also understand validity, but you might not be familiar with the proper use of this term. As I briefly mentioned during the 13 tips video of this series, that was the second video of the entire series, students often confuse the terms validity and truth. Here's a couple of examples that might help show you how they are not only different, but independent. Once you understand their independence, it will be easier to understand the relation they have to one another. Premise 1. My cat is a fish is false. Premise 2. All fish can fly is false. The conclusion, therefore my cat can fly, is false. Yet. The argument has a valid structure. You can see that, can't you? If all fish could fly and my cat is a fish, then it follows that my cat could fly. Logically untouchable, perfect structure, but a false and nonsense conclusion. Here's another one. My cat is a fish. False. All fish have fur. False. Conclusion, therefore my cat has fur. True. What kind of argument is this? Well, guess what? Another valid one. Again, if you pause the video and think about it, the logical structure is correct. This time giving us a truth, but with nonsense premises. And what about this one? Premise 1 is true. When it rains, the sidewalks become wet. Premise 2, it is not raining. Imagine that the time premise 2 is uttered, it is not raining. So premise 2 is true as well. Also, imagine that the time the conclusion is uttered, the sidewalk is not wet. So the conclusion is true as well. As some of you might intuitively recognize, this argument has an invalid structure. For the rest of you, I will explain why later. Are you beginning to see that validity and truth don't necessarily go hand in hand? In other words, do you see that every premise and conclusion can be true, as it is in this example, and you might still have an invalid argument? Or all your premises and conclusion could be false, but you could have a valid argument. Yes, that's because truth is about content and validity is about form, about logic. So keep that in mind when you're trying to distinguish them. Perhaps this has intrigued you enough to want to take a class on logic. I cannot give you a crash course on logic, but I want to eliminate some key concepts by an analogy that I find helpful. The analogy should also help you see how these independent entities, truth and validity, interact in an argument. This is my analogy. It's very simple and very memorable. However, if you feel you have a firm grasp on the lesson up to here, you can skip the analogy. So, you want to know how much you spent on Christmas shopping. You have all your receipts and a calculator. In order to find out exactly how much you spent in total, you need two and only two things. One, that you enter the numbers correctly, and two, that your calculator is working. One without the other is useless to you. The only way of guaranteeing that you get the correct result is a working calculator and correct entries. And if you have both, it's impossible to get incorrect results. Now, spoil sports, keep in mind that this is an analogy. So anything that would interfere with the calculator's working, such as a magnetic storm, is to be classified as part of the fact of whether the calculator works or not. Now, imagine that the calculator is malfunctioning. but you've entered all the numbers correctly. You might still get the correct total by accident because a malfunctioning calculator is unpredictable. But there is no guarantee of that. So you would not use a calculator that you know to be faulty. Alternately, imagine that your calculator is working, but this time you made errors in entering the numbers. Again, you might accidentally get the correct results. Result. Say if your incorrect entries kind of balance each other out. But again, there is no guarantee that you will get the correct total. For that reason, you would always use some method of double checking your entries. What's the lesson here? The only guarantee of a correct total is both correct entries and a working calculator. All other options are a gamble, and the odds are against you. You may get the correct total with a malfunctioning calculator, mistakes in entries, or both, but it's more likely that you will not. Similarly, you don't want an argument, especially in an academic setting, but usually in all areas of life, except in some kind of games when deception is part of a game, to produce a true conclusion by luck. That is the purpose of my calculator analogy. Just like with calculating your expenses, you want a guaranteed true conclusion, not one based on chance. Let me spell out the analogy. Premises in an argument are like the entries you input to your calculator, and validity is like the correct functioning of the calculator. So premises are like an input, and validity is like a calculator, like a machine. To return to the independence of truth and validity, just like whether you are making correct entries is independent of whether the calculator is working or not, the truth of the premises of an argument is independent of the logical machinery you subject it to. They are separate things and must be evaluated separately. In the end, however, for soundness, that is, for guaranteed truth of a conclusion, or cogency, that is the probable truth of a conclusion, you need both. Correct entries alone aren't enough to guarantee correct total in a calculator. Similarly, true premises aren't enough for the truth of the conclusion. A working calculator alone isn't enough to guarantee correct total from a calculator. Similarly, validity is not enough for the truth of the conclusion. And when you get a true conclusion, you don't want to get it by luck. You want truth to be arrived at by a valid logical form and from truth premises. That is why you need to check the arguments in an article, both for the truth of the premises and the validity of the logical form. Notice that guaranteed true conclusion also means impossible to arrive at a false conclusion. And that also means argument is sound. It is important that you know that these expressions are all the same thing, because validity analysis normally includes the term soundness rather than the term guarantee. Essentially, soundness is the name we give to that guarantee, or the name we give to the fact that false conclusion is impossible. You might still be worried that you won't be able to recognize the valid form of arguments in the same way you won't know just by staring at the guts of a calculator, no matter how long, whether it's working or not, unless you're an electronic engineer. If you want to know all the valid and invalid forms of arguments, I urge that you take formal or informal logic classes. But I can assure you again that all of you can and do recognize valid and invalid forms of arguments intuitively in day-to-day life. Because consciously or unconsciously, you're using a simple rule of thumb that works for all forms. If all the premises are true, can the conclusion ever be false? If it is impossible for the conclusion to be false when all the premises are true, the argument is valid. Think of the calculator again. If it is impossible to get incorrect results when you enter the data correctly, then your calculator is working. By analogy, if it is impossible to arrive at a false conclusion when you enter only truths into the argument, then the correct form of logic has been employed. The machinery of the argument is functioning properly. It is valid. But if it is possible for the conclusion to be false even when all the premises are true, then the argument is invalid. Let's think of the calculator again. If it is possible to get incorrect results when you've entered all the numbers correctly, then something is wrong with the calculator, as faulty. By analogy, if it is possible to arrive at a false conclusion when you only enter truths into the argument, then a faulty form of logic has been used and the machinery of the argument is faulty. It is invalid. Let's put it all together again. So, if you enter truths and use correct logic, or to put it in different words, if you use a valid argument, you'll always get truth. But that is all we can say. There's no corresponding symmetrical message to give regarding false statements and invalid arguments. Just as we can only know that a working machine and correct number entry will always give a correct result, but cannot say a faulty calculator or incorrect entries will always give incorrect results, we cannot say that a false statement or faulty logic, meaning invalid arguments, will always give false conclusions. I am now going to give you examples to show you why we cannot make those claims. If you find the language used in the next few minutes unusual or confusing, you can move forward until you get to the next calculator image. Remember this argument from earlier? As promised, I'm ready to briefly explain why this argument has an invalid form. Well, this argument has an invalid form because it's possible for the conclusions to be false, even if both premises are true. What was our definition? An argument is valid only if it is impossible for the conclusion to be true if all the premises are true. This argument does not fit into that category. Follow me to see why. The conclusion that the sidewalk is not wet could be false. In other words, the sidewalk could be wet even if it's not raining. Perhaps the road sweeper went by and wet the sidewalk. Perhaps someone just washed their car. Perhaps it's snowing instead of raining, and the snow is immediately melting. If this were a valid argument, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are true, which they are. But we've just shown that it's not impossible for the conclusion to be false. To say it differently, we've shown that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. That is why this argument is invalid. This argument is an invalid deductive argument. How about a valid deductive argument? In this argument, if premise 1 and 2 are true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. If all humans are mortal and Yao Ming is human, then Yao Ming has to be mortal. It's impossible for it to be the case that Yao Ming is not mortal. So this argument is valid. Does that mean it's sound? No. For it to be sound, both premises have to be true in addition to its validity. Only if both premises are true, the argument is also sound. Premise 2 might not be true. Someone might have named their motorbike Yao Ming, and therefore premise 2, the one that says Yao Ming is human, could be false. But if it's true that Yao Ming is human, then this argument is sound. All sound deductive arguments, not just simple ones like this, give us certainty. In contrast, in an inductive argument, we are seeking probability or probable truth, not certainty. If we were treating this like a deductive argument, it would turn out to be invalid because the premises can be true and the conclusion false. Aisha might happen to be one of the few university students who are younger than 18. But this is not a deductive argument, it is an inductive argument. So we will ask if it's probable for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. When we ask that, depending on our subject, we have varying levels of probability in mind. That is why in inductive arguments we use the term strength instead of validity. A strong version of this argument would look like this. It is improbable for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. This is a strong inductive argument. It is also intuitively true. Think about it. Because if Aisha is a university student, and most university students are older than 18, then it's highly probable that Aisha is older than 18. On the other hand, you should be able to see why this version would be a weak inductive argument. If only a few university students, let's say 1% of them, are younger than 18, Aisha's chances of being younger than 18 is slim. So it is probable that the conclusion is false even when the premises are true. So this is a weak inductive argument. If all of that is confusing, leave this aside for now. It can require practice with different examples to become comfortable with. Depending on what you are learning in your courses, this might make much more sense if you come back to it in a few weeks. For now, let's return to the analogy. As we have said before, truth and validity must be examined separately, but there's a special relationship between them. You may have already noticed that. If premises are true and the form is deductively valid, a true conclusion is guaranteed, and as such, the argument is sound. To repeat something I said earlier, soundness is a name we give to that guarantee. As for inductive arguments, if the premises are true and the form is inductively valid, a probably true conclusion is obtained. And as such, the argument is cogent. If a premise or premises are false, or if the reasoning is weak, then the inductive argument is not cogent. Let's also return to our mantras. Sentences are true or false, or probably true or false, or in alternate terms, likely to be true or false. And what amounts to the same thing for our purposes: premises, assumptions, propositions, conclusions, theses, beliefs, claims can be and only be true or false, or probably true or likely true or false. None of those can be valid or invalid. And only the structure of arguments can be valid or invalid, strong or weak. To say that an argument is valid is just to say that the structure of an argument is valid. The former is just a shorthand for the latter. So remember, since a structure is just a form or a shape, or as I've likened it in analogy, a machine, and cannot be true or false, an argument cannot be true or false. It can only be valid or invalid. If you watched lessons up to this point, you've watched it until its end. That was a more challenging lesson compared to the ones before. It might make more sense, as I said before, if you come back to it later after more practice in class. In this lesson, I have shown a way to evaluate an argument both for the validity of its structure and the truth of its premises. That completes the second step of the 6 steps of writing a philosophy essay. In the next video, we will move on to step 3, planning the essay, which is the last step that comes before beginning to write your essay.